Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Daryl. Welcome back to this Python and Excel for Finance series. In previous videos, we just learned why sometimes we might prefer to use Microsoft 365 and how to use Microsoft 365 to get a stock code. And we also learned how to generate the data at a fixed time interval with three different options that includes the Excel's refresh options, VB8, and also Python. With the use of Excel's refresh options, by default, it allows us to generate the data for every 5 minutes. And on the other hand, with the use of VBA, it helps us to shorten the time interval up to 1 second. In some situations, we might want to store the data in a database. However, for the first two approach, we are not quite able to do so. Therefore, in these lessons, I will introduce you the last methods, that is to use Python to help us to generate the data at a fixed time interval and at the same time store the data at a fixed time interval. In a nutshell, there will be two key steps. In the first step, we will use Python to control the Excel files to generate the data at a fixed time interval. In the second step, we will use the same Python programs to help us to store the data in a database. So let's dive into the code to see how we can do that. First of all, we need to import the times library, and we will use the split methods to avoid some fatal error. And then for storing the data, again, we will use pandas to help us to do so. At the same time, we also would like to know when we store the data, so we will create a datetime object for the datetimes column. To control and connect to the Excel spreadsheets, we will use win32com.client to dispatch the Excel applications and then to connect to the workbook. And once we connect to the workbook, of course, we can then refresh the workbook to update the data. And then the final library that we would like to import is to handle some fatal error. So we would like to import the comms error from the Python com. Just like what I mentioned before, there will be two key steps. This is the first step to control the Excel spreadsheets to generate the data at a fixed time interval. And this is the second step to retrieve the data or to download the data into an Excel file. So in that case, we will create two functions. This process data is to help us to store the data into an Excel file. And then the other functions is the refresh and save functions. These functions will allow us to connect to a particular workbook and then refresh that workbook and save the result or save the update. So this is for step 2 and this is for step 1. Therefore, there will be 3 key tasks in these refresh and save functions. First of all, the first task is to connect these to an Excel and workbook. And then the second task is to refresh that particular workbook. And finally, we can then save that update and save that workbook. And then we can put these functions inside a while loop so that it will keep repeating this step 1. That means it will keep helping me to connect this to an Excel, refresh that notebook and refresh that workbook and save that workbook. Logically, we will put these functions at the end under these refresh save functions. That means we're going to connect to that particular workbook and then refresh that workbook and then save that workbook. And then based on that particular latest workbook, we will then process the data, capture all the data and save in a CSV or any other database. However, for refreshing a workbook, normally it takes you around 1 to 2 seconds to do so. And while it's refreshing or it's updating, we cannot save the workbook, and that will create a fatal error if we do so. And therefore, in between, we need to wait until the refresh complete, so as to ensure that particular workbook is ready to save. Therefore, we will just put these process functions in between to buy some time. However, if your computer is really fast, in that case, we might want to introduce a sleep over here to make sure that everything has been refreshed and is ready to save. Now we understand the logics. Let's work on it step by step. But before we dive in, let's take a look on the workbook that I created. This is the workbook that contains 9 currency. That includes the price changes, and also the percentage changes. And you can, of course, manually click on the data and then refresh the data. But in our example, we would use Python to connect this workbook and then refresh the data and then save the workbook and then retrieve the data. So now let's see how we can do that. First thing first, we would like to connect these Python programs to the particular workbook. So in that case, I would like to dispatch an Excel applications. So we will use these methods. That is the win32.com.clients, and then use the dispatch methods. And what we would like to have is to, what we would like to have is to dispatch an Excel applications. And then once we dispatch an Excel applications, we would like to use that particular applications to help us to open a workbook. And in that case, we would like it to open that particular workbook that contains our data. And I just store them into this path. So in your case, please feel free to just change the path to where you store the Excel file. And I will just put it outside these functions to set it as a global variable. So here we have 2 steps. The first step is to dispatch the Excel applications. And then once we have these Excel applications, we will then use it to open a particular workbook. However, sometimes we might not be able to that particular workbook. So in that case, we will just use try except methods to handle these error. And there's two particular errors that I faced so far. One is the attributes error, and the other is the columns error. And in that case, I will just print out there's an error when we opened the workbook. And in that case, if we are not able to open the workbook, I'm not going to execute the following part. Therefore, I need a Boolean. So I will just use this as a Boolean ready to open equals to true if we can open the workbook. Otherwise, just set the ready to open to false. So in that case, if we have successfully opened the workbook, and we will then just refresh that workbook, process the data, and save that workbook. Otherwise, I will just break these functions and repeat these again because we have a while loop over here. So these are the first steps, connect to a workbook. And then in the second step, I would like to refresh the workbook. So in that case, I will use this workbook objects, one of the methods called .refresh all methods to refresh the workbook. And then just like what I mentioned, I would like to take a pause over here to make sure that the refresh has been completed. To make sure the refresh has been completed, you can add another method from this Excel app. And so what you would like to add is to use this calculate. Let's just copy that. That is the calculate until a synchronized queries has been done. So this function is to hold the programs and wait until all refresh has been completed. However, sometimes there will be a clash on the synchronization function. So in that case, I will just create a ready to sync Booleans to help me to cater or to help me to handle these types of error. So in these cases, I will just use a while loop to make sure this synchronizations has been completed before we move on to the following part. So if that can be done, in that case, I will just set this ready to sync equals to false to break the loop. Otherwise, if there's a prompt error, in that case, I will just force it to take a 1 second pause and then just print out the workbook sync error. And of course, I will just continue this while loop. So just set it to ready to sync equals to true. Of course, logically, you can just remove this sentence. However, I just would like to make it clear over here. And finally, once we refresh the workbook and synchronize the workbook, we are now ready to close and save the workbook. By setting the parameters as true, that means we are going to close the workbook and save the workbook. If that is equals to false, it only means that we are going to close that workbook. Just to make sure the workbook has been closed, I'm also going to set the workbook equals to none. However, sometimes there might be a clash and creates a fatal error. So in that case, I will use the same logic that we have over here. I will just set it as a ready to save to make sure that we can save the workbook before we leave these functions. So I will just try to close and save this workbook. And if the save has been done, I will just set these booleans to false to break this while loop. Otherwise, I will just let it take a pause for a second and then just print the workbook save error. And for the ready to save, I will just keep it as a true to make sure it continues before it leaves these functions. And because previously we have dispatched this Excel stock applications, so finally I would like to create this dispatcher. And now we are ready to process the data, which is the final step. So we've just complete this path. And now we are working on here to process the data. Maybe first of all, let's see what we got. So just use a pandas functions to with the CSV file, with this CSV file. Sorry, that should be a with an Excel file because I'm using the Excel SX. So with this Excel file, remember this is a with Excel instead of with CSV. And then say, for example, maybe just print out this data frame. And let's see what we have. So let me stop the program over here. And you can see here we have successfully to pull out the 9 currency. Let me open the file. We have successfully to pull out the 9 currency over here. And then we have successfully updated the Excel, refresh the Excel, and also save the Excel. As a result, you can see that these 2 data frame have different value. So for example, for the first row, you can see they have different value. We have successfully updated that. And say for example, for the column 2, sorry, for the row 2 over here, you can see there's also an update. So we have successfully connect to the Excel, refresh the workbook, and finally save that workbook. What we would like to do over here is just to reshaped or we retrieve the informations and we package them before we save them in a CSV file. And first thing first, I just would like to create another data frames, and the first columns only contains the name of the currency pairs, and that is NANs. So as a result, I will just ignore the first columns, and then because these are all numbers, so I just convert them into value and finally put everything into a list. So now we have a data list. Maybe let's print it out to see what we got. Because right now it's a list of lists, so I would just like to make them into a single list. In that case, I need to use two for loops to loop through all these elements and put them into a list. So what I would like to do is to just loop through these item. The first is the sublist in this data, and then once we have this sublist, I would like to retrieve the items under this sublist. Therefore, there are two loops over here. The first loop is to retrieve all the sublists. That includes this one sublist, the second sublist, the third sublist, and so and so. And then inside each of the sublists, I would like to retrieve the item. That is these first items, second items, and third items. And then it will go to another sublist. The first items, the second item, and third items. And then for each of the item, I would just like to standardize them to 6 decimal placed. And now let's see what we got. And here we go. We have successfully put them into a single list. The next things that I would like to do is to create a timestamp, just like what I did before in others videos. Because I live in Hong Kong, the time difference between me and between Hong Kong and US is 12 hours. So I would just minus 12 and to set up the timestamps. And then for the formats, I would just put them into year, month, date, hour, minutes, seconds. And for this timestamp, I would like to insert it at the beginning of this data set, because everything is in a list, so I can just directly convert them into a data frame. And then let me show you what we have. Because now everything is a time series, or this data frame is like a time series. So I would like to just transpose it into to store all these data into a row instead of column. And finally, of course, we can then just save everything into a CSV file. And remember, we would like to append at the end of that particular CSV file. And we do not have a header, and we do not have an index. And then the path that I would like to save is over here. And then if I, this is typo, and then if I run this program, and you can see we have successfully connect to the Excel, refresh that particular workbook, and also save that particular workbook, and also successfully store the data in a CSV file. Say for example, for the first data, that is this row, and then for the second, this is this row, and it just take me around 5 to 4 seconds to capture each of the to capture the data for each of the row. And in total, there are 9 currency pairs, and for each of the currency pairs, we have 3 attributes. So we have just learned how to use different methods to pull the data at a fixed time interval from the Excel file or from the Microsoft 365. And that includes the Excel refresh options, VBA, and also the Python. And then with the use of Python, we are able to use the Python to control and update the workbook. And at the same time, we can then extend the functionality of these Python programs to help us to store the data in a CSV file. In the upcoming lessons, I will show you how to visualize the result for this path and this path with the use of Excel. So see you in the next video. Bye bye.